Number 43 in the 50 most relevant. That is where we find ourselves in my 50 most relevant players of 2025. We take AFL Fantasy SuperCoach Dream Team, all the players, all the prize points, put them in a big melding pot, and then I ultimately give you my subjective list of who I think are the most relevant players to have a conversation about this fantasy football preseason. Joining me on this podcast, he's a regular part of the coaches panel, but when we have a Fremantle player on, there is no way he can ever be defeated to have a chat about one of his Dockers. He's back on the podcast, mate. It's MiniMonk. Hello, mate. Talking about Luke Ryan today on the episode. A fascinating player to look back at and look forward to what might be in 2025.
Very much so, you know. And we've got two Freo players in the first 10 of the list from the 50s to the 40s already. Will there be some more to come? Who knows? You're the one who makes the list. But I'm very excited to talk about Luke Ryan because he's a very interesting player to talk about for the 2025 season.
100%. He is a seasonal average of 102 in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. Means in both those formats, he hits the $1 million markings. While in SuperCoach, a seasonal average of 116.6 means he's over that 600K price point, $628,300. Last year, a phenomenal season, a career season, you could say, in many different markers, specifically in the area of seasonal high scores, because they were both career high scores, a 197 in SuperCoach against the Tigers, while it was a 161 in that same game, in the same opponents. Not a bad score in AFL Fantasy, especially if you had the C or the VC markings on him. He's such an interesting player to look at, and we'll deep dive into his numbers and his season and how he scores in a moment. But he's ranked per game number 1 in the league for marks and rebound 50s, number 2 in the league for kicks, 4th for meters gained, and 7th for effective disposals. While he's probably not the most adventurous playmaker we see in the AFL, what he does, the Dockers just build so much of their defensive core in and around him, knowing that if there's an intercept marker to take, he's probably going to get that in sort of that inside 30 to defensive 50 range. If there's a kick in to have, he'll get his lion's share of those. And then there's just those games where they want to try to ice the clock. He just finds a way to get involved in every single ball movement outside of the defensive Fremantle lines. He's just incredible how he goes about getting his hands on the footy almost every single defensive outlet.
Yeah, it's crazy how much of the ball actually goes through him. I think Freo have a propensity to go through him. You talk about the kick-ins. If he's not getting 90 to 95% of the kick-ins next year, I'll still be shocked. He does a lot of good things with it, a lot of things that Freo fans probably aren't as happy with it. And same with some of the icing of the clock. Sometimes he probably gets it a little bit too much for our liking. But as you read out those stats, you know, you talk about how many marks he's getting, how many effective disposals he's getting. A lot of that just comes from the fact that he is almost the quarterback for the team. He's the one who just controls the play for the team, finds the right options to be able to then open up the rest of the field. And because of that, he's a pretty safe player. You know, he occasionally gets a very high ceiling score when the game is being iced. You know, you talk about that 160 against Richmond in AF and the 197 that he got in SuperCoach for that. They were just icing the game for about half time. There was no reason for them to take the game on anymore. It was over. You know, and then there was a 150 against Geelong later on in the season in both AF and SuperCoach as well. That one was a little bit different. I think there wasn't as much icing on the game, but it was just a lot of, I think the Cats really forced Freo to have to play a lot slower, and it didn't really fall into the way that the Dockers wanted to play that game. And because of that, you know, he always has that potential to drop an absolutely monster ceiling score, probably equal to any of the other defenders in that premium tier. But I think what might set him apart to some of those other really premium guys is just how poor his floor can be at times. If the opposition tries to put someone on him, if they put attention into him, if they really try and stifle the way the Dockers want to play, or if the Freo Dockers actually just want to change the way that they play any particular game, it can really affect his ceiling and puts him at like a 60s or 70s score. And so he's the type of player that I would compare to someone like a Zach Merritt. You know he's going to get to roughly what his score is going to be for the season. You know he's going to get roughly to around about that 95 to 100 marker in AFL Fantasy and around about the 100 to 105 score in SuperCoach. but you're never really enamored to start him. You don't really want to just start him because if he drops a 60 in those first 3 or 4 weeks, everyone else is going to be able to get onto him cheaper. If you get that ceiling score, that's great, but you probably wanted to capitalize if he is getting that ceiling score. And to do that, you need to be able to captain him. And that's a scary prospect, captaining a defender when, people are looking at the likes of Marshall, Cherry, Bontempelli, Dacos, Sheasel. There's a lot of really good captaincy options in the early rounds. And yes, he does have the favorable fixtures and he's a nice person to VC. But when those favorable fixtures lie, it doesn't land itself well to being that VC option. And you're really hoping that he doesn't drop one of those 60s early on in the rounds, early on in the year.
Yeah, it's so true. Like, of his 16 tons last year in SuperCoach, 10 are over 120. So a nice conversion rate that's there. A handful of those are 140 pluses plus that 197. I suppose SuperCoach is probably the format of the two that scoring basement that you alluded to isn't as painful because there's just the one score under 75 last year. Number one player in that format for total points for defenders. If you want to count last year's defenders available or this year's, either way, he's basically a top 3 guy by average. Whereas in fantasy, 11 tons last year, 7 over 120. So not quite as high conversion of hundreds to games, but probably marginally better of 120 plus scores. But there's 6 scores under 80. And that's what you're alluding to about this guy that's got that basement that hurts. Is top 20 overall for points, inside the top 6 for points and averages for our defenders as well. You mentioned this interesting, can he get a hot start? Do you overpay? Because last year, he's exiting the mid-season buys with a 109 average in fantasy, and let's just call it a flat-out 130 in SuperCoach. Post-buy, he only goes the 92.7 in fantasy and the 104.4 in SuperCoach. Both perfectly fine averages, but when you're paying for him to be 25 points per game higher in SuperCoach or about 17 points per game higher in fantasy, that's where it stings. So I guess the question I want to ask you is, what caused, from your perspective, that pre and post split? Was there a particular run of games last year that was really favourable, that was more the abnormality than the normative? Or was there a game style evolution from Fremantle in that back half of the season? Or could it have been a combination of both?
I actually think it is a combination of both. And there's a massive hot streak that he went on starting in round 8, where he had those ceiling games in both AFL Fantasy and SuperCoach against the Tigers. It's not often that you see a player go 160 AF. Not in this day and age. You might get 10 of them in a season. And then he's gone 197 SuperCoach as well, just because of how much efficiency it was. And he jumped it up in that last quarter. I think he went plus 60 SuperCoach, plus 60 AF in that last quarter. It was really quite filthy. The next game afterwards, he has the Swans, and the Dockers played all right in that game. They were able to, slow the game down a bit. But then the next 3 after that, St Kilda, Magpies, Demons especially, they controlled the game quite hard in 2 out of those 3 games. And especially in that Demons game, him and Jordan Clark both got off the chain in Alice Springs. And it was, Freo playing through them a lot. Now, towards the second half of the season, they tried to take the ball out of, Ryan's hands a bit more and try to put it in the halfback runners like Clark, like Chapman, and use the run and carry for the team a lot more. And I think that is why his scoring started to decrease a bit, especially those ceiling games. They didn't really want to junk it up. They're trying to go hard for wins, trying to go hard to actually get the ball from the D50 to the forward 50. And it didn't leave a lot of that junking that we actually saw earlier on in the season. I think that game style is more towards what Freo want to play with, and they want to try and keep the run and carry. There will obviously be the occasional game where he can junk it up hard, and I wouldn't be surprised if he drops a one or two 140 plus type games in AFL Fantasy and 160 plus games in SuperCoach. But if you're starting him, you're taking on the risk and saying, I think those are going to happen early on in the season, and I think he's going to put enough separation from me and towards the other premium defender options that it's worth the price tag. And that might well happen, but it's probably a bigger risk than what I'd be considering to take.
Yeah, it's true. At this price point, like, he's coming off the back of a career high season, even with that slow 8 weeks trend the year. Now, there's still some decent ceiling games in this final 8 weeks across the formats. It's not exactly like he's stuck in purgatory of 80s and 90s. There is some ceiling games that pop through there.
Mm.
But as I look back at that sort of last 8 weeks of the year, Mini, that feels like that's a bit more return to the true average territory of what Luke Ryan is, which is over the last handful of years. When again, he hasn't missed a game in 3 years, so he's durable as, but he's that his guy in fantasy and high his low hundreds guy in SuperCoach.
I mean, you look at his career averages since 2019 in fantasy. It's 80, it's a 70, which adjusts to about a 90 in 2020. And then you go 88, 85, 99 last year as well, which was quite high. And again, I don't think that's the game style that Freo want to play with. It was a lot of slow ball movement. And then a 102 this year. And if we look at SuperCoach, 2019, 96, 2020, 107, 99, 97, 110, and then a spike to 117. If he comes back 5 points per game in AFL Fantasy and 7 to 8 points per game in SuperCoach, I won't be shocked. And that's probably the difference between that first half of the season, second half of the season. He is still going to get those spike games. And quite likely, he's still going to be in and around the marker of a top 6 defender in all formats. It's just the question is going to be, when is the time to jump on? You talk about that back half of the season in 2024. There's a 63 AF and a 75 SuperCoach. There's a 67 AF and a 98 SuperCoach. There's a 79 AF and a 68 SuperCoach. If he drops one of those sorts of games early on in the season at his price tag, he's going to drop his price by 50, 100K in AFL Fantasy and probably by about 50K in SuperCoach as well. And that might be a good jump on point because as with all the Fremantle players coming into the 2025 season, they have that fantastic buy in round 13. And if you can jump onto him right before it or right after it when his price is right, you're getting a player that's playing all 4 of the other buy rounds and only misses the buy round with one out of the team, which is a great spot to be in.
Yeah, I suppose people might be tempted by Luke Ryan at the start of the season on a couple of moments, because you're right. All the indicators to me flat out look at career high average. As the year went on, Fremantle arguably looked much more like the team that made finals that few seasons removed. They've added certainly some more firepower in Bolton in the off-season. But you look at all the ingredients and you go, okay, he probably is that upgrade in and around the buy once his price has bottomed out a little bit. Because again, you're talking $1 million markers in fantasy and Dream Team, 600K in SuperCoach. You can't afford the slow start. This hurts more than a failed breakout option is the top end premium that drops 5, 8, 10 points per game of price point average versus early return. That's the thing that really slows your season's movement more so than a mid-pricer that failed for a week or two or the odd rookie roulette miss. But I suppose the positive that people might be looking at is some of those top-end defenders that I want to get, and even breakout range, there's a lot that do have an early season buy. Ryan doesn't have that. We talked in the Sean Darcy episode a little over a week ago now about this, at least for a ruckman, a favourable fixture.
Yeah, I mean, the fixture's great for him to start off with. It's not the perfect fixture that you can ask for a defender, but it's not too shabby after at all. It's just the question is, is there enough good in and amongst the okay and bad? And to my eyes, it's like, yeah, there probably is. You're looking at those games against the Western Bulldogs, you're looking at those games against Richmond, because those are historically teams that allow those half-backers to really rack up and score highly. But is it a sustained 3 to 4 weeks where he can punish you like he punished the non-owners in 2024, where he's going at 130 AF and 150, 160 SuperCoach over a sustained period? It's very hard to say that that is what you can expect in those opening rounds. Yes, the early buys do allow people with ceiling, but if you talk about his ceiling, he had probably 4 ceiling games in 24 rounds. In the year before, it was probably just the 2 looking at it, really. In 2023, he had a 142, 168 SuperCoach, and then a 156 AF, 171 SuperCoach. If you just get those 2, but they're split, you get one in the first half of the season, one in the second half of the season, it's not perfect for it. And I know that you talk about, there's all the other premium options that have the early buys. There's a lot that don't. People are looking at the likes of Jack Sinclair and Desire Wangan Medler. You've got Harry Sheasel, who doesn't have an early buy either. You've got Lockie Whitfield and Dane Zorko, both do have one. But even going down there for a bit further, you've got Nick Martin, You got Jordan Clark in the same team who also doesn't have the early buy and comes in, 50K cheaper in SuperCoach and about 70, 80K cheaper in AFL Fantasy. Nick Newman as well, can't don't have the early buy. There's enough there that you can actually get by without saying the early buy is a differential for why I want to pick him compared to, say, a Lachie Whitfield or, say, a Dane Zorko.
We often talk about risk profile in our starting squads, specifically around injured players and the volume of breakout players. I think if you're going for multiple in that category, and a lot of people are going 2, 3, 4 across their squads, 30, 31, they're getting a handful of these guys. And it's because the amount of trades we have available to us enable our risk profile to be higher than it used to be 3, 5, 8 years ago in these games. Luke Ryan, to me, feels like if you're starting with him, you're adding an extra layer of risk profile to your starting squad, given that you need him to not just match his average, but to supersede it in that hot stretch territories that you alluded to really make it worthwhile. And I think if you've got a bunch of other riskier, quote unquote, types of mid-price injured guys, fixture runners in that first 6 weeks, I just don't like putting an element of risk profile at this top end of the tree. If you are spending that $1 million marker in fantasy, 600 plus in SuperCoach, to me, you're wanting something that feels really bulletproof. And I don't know if his durability certainly is, but him to say he's going to rock 120 plus average across the formats to come out of the gate swinging, to do what you're paying for him to do, just don't have that solid confidence to add that element of risk profile to my starting squad.
It's the balance, like you say, he doesn't have an injury history. You can guarantee that he's probably going to play all the games of the season because he just doesn't get injured. And a lot of those halfback type players really don't have that heavy of an injury history. There's a few, around thereabouts, like Dane Zorko's got a bit, Whitfield's got a bit of a random injury history. Houston's had a couple of smaller ones in his time as well. But Ryan is bulletproof in terms of that. The risk comes from if he doesn't meet the same scoring potential for price. And it's definitely there, and you do have to balance it. I just think that there's probably better value elsewhere to start off with in terms of someone that you think can exceed their average or exceed their price, someone you think is a better fixture to start off with, someone you think has captaincy potential at the same price tag, because you look in their midfield and there's players that are at that 630K marker where you go, yeah, I'd be comfortable captaining you on any given week. Even you look at someone like Tom Green, who comes in much cheaper because of his injury discount. He's 50K cheaper than Ryan is in SuperCoach, and 20K cheaper than what he is in AFL Fantasy. And you'd probably rather trust the captaincy with him compared to someone like Ryan. That's where the risk comes in with him. It's not that he's going to break down. It's not that he's going to be able to score week in, week out. It's just that he doesn't do enough for you to start off with.
Yeah. The 50 most relevant isn't just about the 50 players you should only consider in your starting squad and stuff what could be after round one lockout ends and rolls through. It's about looking at the season in totality, the makeup of our squad, the cadence of when and how we trade into players, and the pedigree that they have to ultimately deliver to you, hopefully, a career best season and winning one of these salary cap formats. So is he someone you want to start with? Maybe not, but as an upgrade option, as someone that's shown he's a top-line defender for multiple seasons, yeah, he might not be in your starting squad, but you've got to consider him as an upgrade during the season.
He's like what I said with Zach Merritt. He's the exact epitome of Zach Merritt, but in the defensive line. Merritt is a player that you really typically don't want to start because he's normally priced at what he's going to do, but at some point during the season you can get him at a little bit cheaper, and when it comes to round 24 and it's the end of the season, you want him there in your team. I think that's the way I viewed Luke Ryan for 2025.
Yeah, it's a good summary. What does it mean for him on draft day, though? If you're picking him on the Keeper platform, which is the draft platform of choice for the coaches panel in 2025, I don't think anyone would doubt that he's going to go off the board as a D based on what his average is delivering for us. Don't see him being anybody's first defender off the entirety of the draft board, but he'll definitely be someone's D. And again, we talk about this beautiful durability. That's so critical in drafts. Just knowing I'm going to get basically 100 guy in fantasy, a 105 to 115 guy in SuperCoach, and he's going to anchor my defense. He's going to play every week, and he's got those ceiling games to win me those matchups on those tight Sunday night games when I need to chase someone down.
Yeah.
Or if you've got 150 that you're trying to chase and Luke Ryan's the last to play, even if you've got the points on the board, you're not feeling confident. Ryan's the kind of guy that can chase that down in a match with ease.
Absolutely, he is. And that's the thing, he's a very safe defender. And the way that you play Classic compared to the way that you play Draft, in Classic, you're inclined to take a bit more risk. And in Draft, you want to take it a bit safer with some of your picks. He's the perfect guy to probably take as like a late second, early third rounder pick. He's probably the third, fourth, maybe fifth defender off the board in AFL Fantasy, and probably about the same in SuperCoach as well. Maybe a little bit later in AFL Fantasy. Some people tend to play for a bit more upside in some of the defenders. But he's the perfect player to take at that point. And yeah, as you say, he's going to be a D1. He's going to play 24 games for the year. He's a perfect player to pick early enough and be confident that he's not going to be what wins or loses you a draft matchup.
Yes, it certainly is. Hey, mate, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk, not just about one of your dockers, but just to talk fantasy footy with you again. MiniMonk will have you on in a couple more days as the 50 most relevant continues to roll on.
Happy to be here and keen to chat in a couple of days.
Looking forward to it. If you want to go back and check out any of the other players that we've revealed so far in the 50 most relevant, maybe you're just getting your pre-season rolling, getting back into some kind of 2025 life or work routine. We got a new episode every single day to kickstart your pre-season. There's already over a week's worth of content you can go and check out. If you haven't listened or watched, make sure you do so. If you're watching this on YouTube and you haven't liked the video or subscribed to the channel, make sure you do that and comment below. Are you trading into Luke Ryan? What do you think he's going to average this year? Let us know. Give the podcast, if you're listening, a 5-star rating on whatever platform you're choosing to listen to. If you've not become a part of our Patreon army yet, you need to do that. Our breakout and premium tiers are getting early access to these podcasts a day ahead. They already know who is in at number 42. One of those people that's just jumped into that premium tier is Fernandez. Thank you so much for jumping on board. This is a shout out from us to you. If you become a premium patron, you get everything that is available to our Patreons. You can jump through at any tier level that is right for you. And if you want to get in touch with us across social media or get any of the links that we've mentioned just there from Patreon, our merch and more, all in the description of this episode. So who's at number 42? A special guest on the podcast, Mitch Hasey, is coming back. Now, little fun fact from the Fantasy Ball Boys. We had him on for just the one episode of the 50 most relevant last year, and it was for Lockie Whitfield. It was a value defender that's been a premium before, that had a pathway to giving us a little bit of value, and ultimately, he finished 16th, I think it was, in AFL Fantasy last year. It was the one player that never moved in and out of his squad. He was there for the whole 24 weeks. So we thought we'd strike the rock twice and see if we can make it work. A defender that's previously been a premium and now offers us some value. Mitch, don't you dare fail me, mate. We are running it back 2 years in a row. Who is Mitch joining us on the podcast tomorrow? Well, who's he talking about? You'll find out in 24 hours.